Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for hopping in. We'll give it a minute or so to let everyone find their Zoom links, and then we'll get on started with our conversation. In the meantime, you can enjoy some music. About another minute or 30 seconds, and we'll get started. Right. I'm gonna slow play down the music there and we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global Entrepreneurship Week, Sacramento 2021, powered by Western Health Advantage. We're excited you joined us for this discussion on the Startup DEI framework, how to unlock new gains by building diverse teams. So we're excited to have you all in this space and for this conversation. My name's Cameron Law, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Carlson Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And then I also serve as the Sacramento organizer for Global Entrepreneurship Week. If you're not familiar with the Carlson Center, we serve as a regional hub and platform for providing approachable and accessible entrepreneurial education, community, and support to enable startup founders of all backgrounds to explore and launch their businesses. And we have this clear mission to make the greater Sacramento region a premier hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. And we work with entrepreneurs across this continuum that we call the entrepreneurial journey, which is broken into three core areas of support, which are discover, build, and launch. And Global Entrepreneurship Week comes under our Discover set of programs to really create new on-ramps and pathways for individuals to explore that entrepreneurial journey and make those connections and build that community that they need to survive as they launch their businesses. The last thing I want to point out for Global Entrepreneurship Week, it is indeed a global celebration. So we're joining over 180 countries around the world in celebrating Global Entrepreneurship Week and the role entrepreneurship plays in building thriving communities all around the world. So we're really excited to have you here for this discussion. And without further ado, I'm going to hop in and introduce our guest speaker that I'll be having a chat with. So I'm going to actually pin us. So give me 1 second with these technological things. So I'm going to pin Mariah there, and I'm going to add me as a spotlight. So as we hop into the conversation portion of our session, I just want to introduce Mariah Lichtenstern, who's our guest speaker here today. Really excited to have her in the space. And Mariah works at the intersection of technology, entertainment, and venture capital, and is passionate about accelerating positive social and economic and environmental impact through entrepreneurship. She is an alumna of UC Berkeley, USC, and UCLA, and is a founding partner of Diversity Ventures and launched the Sacramento, California chapter of Founders Institute, which was recognized in Forbes magazine as the third most gender diverse chapter in the world. She also serves as an advisor for the California Clean Energy Fund, CalSeed Initiative, Berkeley Skydeck, Village Capital Finance Forward, Fourth Wave, which is a female founder accelerator, whoop, whoop, and Hayden AI Ethics Advisory, and Yale University School of Medicine's Digital Innovation and Digital Diversity Initiative, and then has recently joined on as a coach for the NSF Convergence Accelerator and serves on a number of boards of Fourth Wave. We got Startup Sac in the house as well, and then the Sacramento Metro Chamber of Commerce, and then has engaged as a member of the UCLA Ventures and Aspen Tech Policy Hub Fellow. So we are in good hands today with Mariah Lichtenstern. So really excited to be in this space with her and to have a conversation about how do we can look at diversity, equity, inclusion as we build teams to be more successful as we grow our ventures and as we bring on capital. And so as we hop into the conversation, I just wanted to share some context around this space. And a lot of this comes from the tech funding equity work that Mariah has done. So I'm going to share a link in the chat for everyone if you want to check out the work she's done at Tech Funding Equity. It's a great initiative to close the funding gap for underestimated and underrepresented founders. So some of the data points I wanted to share with you when we started looking over some of that data, venture capital backed startup related to these venture capital backed startups, only 1% of VC dollars go to Black founders and just under 2% at 1.8% go to Latinx founders. And then as we look at the male versus female, we see that VC-backed founding teams are about 82% of it. The dollars go to all male teams and 6% go to all female founders. So we see a large gap in these fundings. And part of the reason I bring that up outside of just setting the context and seeing the gap that we're trying to fill, but is really looking at not only the moral imperative of this, but the economic imperative as we start to look at this space. And so additional research that's shared through the tech funding equity work that Mariah's led is when you start to actually look at the returns these founding teams are able to provide to their investors. Ethnically diverse founders have 3.2 times the realized returns on their positive exits, whereas all white teams have 2.5 X returns. And so there's this actual increase in returns that you're seeing in these diverse teams. And so I think is really setting the context for our conversation of how you can start to see that economic incentive, but also the moral incentive of building these diverse teams. And so after setting that context, just wanted to hop into, our first kind of question that I have for you is, from an investor perspective, what signals to you that a founder or founding team is really committed to building a diverse and inclusive environment? And when you work with an early stage pre-seed company, how do you kind of advise them on this work?
Well, first of all, thank you, Cameron, for having me here today. I'm super excited to be here celebrating Global Entrepreneurship Week, and you've done a fabulous job as you did last year. So it's a delight to be here, and it's great to see Laura in the house, Laura Good, representing Startup SAC. I feel such an honor and privilege to be on the board after benefiting from so many of those programs. So jumping into your question, I'll just say, typically if a founding team finds their way to my office hours or on my calendar, they're typically motivated. They've done some of the work, and they understand that they can get better returns and better outcomes if they build diverse and inclusive teams. Typically, what I find is that the biggest challenge they face is that they're not networked, because we live in de facto segregated lives. We have a history in this country that is what it is. We tend to be segregated by zip code. We tend to be segregated by the schools that we go to. There are definitely economic drivers of segregation and networks. And so, a lot of the times people are just fine. Like if you're a white guy, most of your friends are white guys. Most of the people you went to school with and kept in contact with are the places that you hang out, right? And maybe you have access through family or your wife or a couple of friends, but you're just not that tapped in. So they come to me partly because they want to lean in on that in addition to building out the other aspects of their business. So it's pretty clear in conversation, and sometimes they'll be a little bit further along than some others, maybe in terms of understanding the dynamics and what biases they may have or what mindset they have. And this is not just a white guy problem, by the way. I mean, there's men from all different backgrounds that are like, where do we find the women? Whereas, women aren't typically having that same problem. There may be some that do because they have mostly male networks, but you can just get a sense right away if a team understands that they need to build a diverse and inclusive team and that they want to, or that they're just kind of nervous about not really knowing how to get started.
Love it. So the networking aspect is certainly a key. And I know, obviously you sit on the board of Startup SAC, and just kind of some of those aspects of bringing founders together and building those intentional networks can be really key to build those diverse teams. And I know in many of our conversations, we, have also looked at it from, diversity of thought in terms of, experience and expertise, right? So say you have a technical expertise in that particular area, and, you tend to hang out with the engineers, right? And maybe they look like you as well. And so having those kind of stepping outside of your sphere of kind of influence and bridging those gaps is a key component to making some of those steps, right? So I love that. And then so when we start to look at these team members at this early stage, and sometimes they are intentional of that focus and trying to build a diverse and inclusive team, but they're saying they're having challenges and a hard time recruiting more diverse teams. What would you look at and maybe recommend that they go and do?
So a couple of things, and it partly depends on where they're located. One of the silver linings of the pandemic is that we've all become more accustomed to remote work, and that has expanded some of our geographic horizons, right? And so we're looking beyond our backyards. So if you live in a place where it's not as diverse as, say, Sacramento, which happens to be the fourth most diverse region in the nation, you can go outside of that geography that you live in to find talent. So some of the ways you can be strategic are, starting with your advisory board, right? You can, just simply go on LinkedIn and do a search for people in your domain, and you can plain and simple see most of the time what background people come from. It's pretty easy to detect if someone is female, and I think now when we have pronouns that help us identify if someone is LGBTQ or maybe non-binary, look for those things. Another really easy way to get started is to tap into affinity groups, right? So for example, I have subscribed through much of my life to Black Enterprise magazine. If you subscribe to a magazine like that, you're going to start to see who the leaders in the upper echelon of the corporate world are, and you could reach out to folks that are listed. We have have a list of powerful women over here, and in reference I have some magazines that I keep in archive that have lists of people in different domains and C-suite. There's Valence, which is a professional network of Black professionals that are in the C-suites of really top tier Fortune 500, 100, Fortune 1000 companies, and you can just start reaching out to those people. Oftentimes they are on LinkedIn, and just say, hey, I'm looking to build a inclusive advisory board and to tap into some underrepresented talent as we build out our company. And you might have some people ignore you, but you might have some people say, I respect that, right? And it's a numbers game. So, just subscribing to outlets like that, subscribing to communities like that. Black Enterprise in particular, they have conferences throughout the year, and many of them are virtual. You can actually attend conferences like that, right? And then you can actually experience what it may be like to be the only person in the room of a certain ethnic background, and develop a little empathy of what it might be like for other people coming into a culture where they're the only one, right? But what I think most people will find is that it's very receptive. People are glad to see that you want to tap in. They feel like they're in a safe space, and if you're there, you're probably safe. Whereas, to be honest, I could walk into a convention or a conference and be the only Black woman, maybe be the only woman, maybe the only Black person, and I don't know how many of those people have hooded robes in their closets or their grandparents' closets. I don't know, right? But when you come into, a Tech Connects conference through Black Enterprise or something like that, I can almost guarantee that you are in an entirely safe space, because the gangbangers don't show up there, right? Like if you have any of those kind of fears or biases that you're not safe, you're in the upper echelon, and you're going to find some amazing talent, and you might have some cognitive dissonance around how intimidating it is, because it's just so many amazing people. And the same could be true for like NSBE, the Black engineers. It can be said for like Grace Hopper, if you're wanting to tap into women, or Anita B. There's all these organizations. There's Latinx organizations. There's organizations of underrepresented Asian groups for, technology and entrepreneurship. So, I mean, it's really like a Google search away to find where those affinity groups are. And even though it may be highly concentrated, people from those affinity groups, they're typically not exclusive, especially in like events. There may be some places where they want a safe space, but they tend to be very open. I mean, I know I'm involved across different affinity groups. And so, just stepping out of your comfort zone, you can really tap into that, and you'll find that you'll be, usually very warmly welcomed, because we all need allies, right? So those are just a few tactical ways that you can get connected into these networks.
Love it. Well, so the first big takeaway is just getting started and stepping outside of that comfort zone, right? I think that's a key component, and there's many different ways you can approach it. So it sounded like, one approach maybe from like a tactical lens is, as you're building your team, is that advisory board role, right? And I think one of the key components is that gives you that additional perspective, right? And so that's kind of the start of like, oh, I'm recognizing I have a bias in the way I'm building my business, or the way I'm creating recruiting practices, whatever that might be, as an aspect. And then tapping into affinity groups. And I think one of the key things there is it starts to establish those authentic relationships and building trust. And I think one of the key things is that going into doing that work, it's going to take time. It's not like, oh, I go meet someone and now it's like, hey, you're an advisor, right? There has to be trust built on both sides of that coin, right? And so recognize as you're going into doing that is part of the process. And then subscribing to content to better, inform yourself, and also see new connections and dots that you can place as you're starting to potentially build that team, and see where people are hanging out. And then lastly was, I think the comment around the conferences and having that experience and being able to empathize, right, is a really key component as you're building the team, right? And especially if you're bringing on, a diverse, advisory board member, and, having empathy for what that might be. If you already have a full white, male advisory board, what is that going to be like? And have some empathy for that conversation and how that might go. So I love those points. And so the next question that I have there is, if you were a founder and you're looking at your kind of founding team or executive leadership, but don't quite see this diverse founding team, what are some steps that you can start to take right away to mitigate some of that unconscious bias that you might be having around your process? I know we hit on some of those in terms of, just going out there and kind of learning, but are there some other tools? I know we've talked about like the Harvard business test and a variety of some of those other things that people can understand where that gap might be for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, of course, we'll tap a little into this. On the Tech Funding Equity site, we actually have a startup DEI pledge, and that's really a good place to start so that you can, assess where you are. But, I'll go back to in what we were saying before. I kind of betrayed my age in talking about magazines, because we all do so much online these days, but there's newsletters like Fortune magazine has a Race Forward newsletter, and subscribing to things like that, where you're getting dripped, content that will help to address some of that cognitive bias and kind of like debug some of what we're all kind of programmed in this country. It's not even always intentional. Like, we're taught since kindergarten which one of these things doesn't belong on Sesame Street, right? And it's just a process of patterns that are reinforced by what we see on TV, what we hear in media, personal experiences that we may have in the context that we're in. And so, helping to break that down, reading books, watching movies from different, backgrounds, they all help to build empathy and expand your horizons in terms of, what mindset that you might be harboring. So, I think that's one of the things. And if you have a team that's under 15, studies have shown that you can still build a culture, right? Once you get beyond that and you start scaling, now you're fixing a culture, right? And so it's really better to, build from the ground up, and you might be the chief DEI officer, right? Because you're wearing so many hats as a founder, that might just be part of your role. But really, bringing folks in and helping them to understand, educating them as to like even what the climate is with say NASDAQ requiring diverse representation on boards. The same is true in California. There's legislation that says you have to have at least one female on your board. And now they're, I think you may have expanded into other elements of diversity there as well. So this is what's coming, and it's coming because people didn't do it voluntarily, and they probably didn't do it voluntarily because it's outside of people's comfort zone, and we already do so many things that are, but this is something in our country that is just particularly prickly, and I know it very well because look, I was born in this body, I'm born this gender, and I couldn't escape it if I wanted to. There's some topics that I would rather discuss than DEI on any given day. And I know it can be uncomfortable, even for me, having lived this life, okay? I know it can be uncomfortable, but the good news is, as you do that work, you become more comfortable. And once you start reaping the benefits of getting to know what the dynamics are, how it may be impacting your culture, it's really, really rewarding to see the outcomes and the results, and to be so comfortable in dealing with people from different backgrounds, because you're no longer feeling awkward and not knowing, because you've done that work, right? And then you're on the other side of it, and it's just all growth, right? So, involving your team and making sure that they understand the importance of them, supporting them. We have a saying at Diversity Ventures, diversity includes you. So making sure that they know diversity does not just mean women, underrepresented people of color, LGBTQ. It means all of us, and therein is the richness that we in the United States in particular have in spades. There's really a competitive advantage that we have, and we just need to harness. So once you get your team understanding that and leaning in and doing the work, and allowing them to fail forward and put their foot in their mouth, and not just be really punitive about it all the time. Not to say there aren't consequences for, malice. If there's malice, that has to be dealt with. But when people are really trying to do the work and they're just making kind of expected mistakes, like, for example, touching a Black woman's hair is a no-no that everybody might not know. You might have a new Black woman in the workplace and someone's touching their hair. Okay, but was it malicious? Did they know better? What can you do to prevent that? Maybe by doing some training ahead of time, and I'm just giving some personal examples, but there are tools, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, that can just help to prepare your team, and things that they can do in the privacy of their home or office, so that when they're live within this culture that you're building, as you bring in increased diversity, they already are kind of at a level where they can really be supported to thrive, and not make some rookie mistakes.
Okay. So yeah, some of the key points you echoed the need for empathy as a core component, and I know we've talked about it, and some of when I've started to look into it, there's kind of the 3 layers of empathy, right? So on the cognitive level, right? So understanding someone else's perspective in a given situation, and then there's that emotional aspect, so right, being able to take on the emotions of someone else in that particular space, and the more you have, I guess, more inputs. So if you're doing the learning, maybe you're not subscribing to magazines anymore, but you're subscribing to newsletters, right? You can understand perspectives and understand that the emotional aspect. And then that last level is really the empathetic concern, right? So if you're in a space or at an advisory board meeting or some sort of team meeting, and really being able to see, okay, well, Mariah hasn't really been brought into this conversation, right? And so how do I, make that happen, and having that empathetic concern as an aspect of that team. And then I love the point on culture. I don't know that I had heard the 15 team member, but I love the kind of that delineation of you're building culture up to a certain point, and then after that, right, you're starting to fix it. And so being conscious when you are a smaller team, how are you building those constructs and processes to build a more inclusive team and way that you ultimately work together, right? And then after that, having it set up so if things are going off the rails, how do you have certain points in time, right? Is it a quarterly time that you talk about your company culture and maybe, hey, we're going off the rails here. How do we get back to where we were when we were at 15 people? Because we've been scaling at a dramatic rate. And then the last point I wanted to point out was the quote that you have at Diversity Ventures is diversity includes you, and really using that as an advantage, right? And one that we have here in the Sacramento region for sure. And really, there's no reason not to have those diverse teams when we're in a region that I think you said is the fourth diverse, certainly west of the Mississippi, right? And so having that as a key aspect as we're moving forward. And so I wanted to jump into some of your work with tech funding equity. You've put a lot of effort into building some methodologies and frameworks that's in line with the Startup DEI pledge. And would love if you can share with us some of the methodology of really these steps. I think you have 4 different steps that you can kind of walk us through, and would love to learn a little bit more about that methodology. And then after that, we can look at the framework that you've built around it.
Absolutely. So if you, I think, let me see if I drop the link in the chat, I'll do a direct link for anyone who wants to follow along. Basically, it's just like the chat that Cameron threw in already. It's techfundingequity.com and then /startup-DEI-pledge. So I went ahead and dropped that in there. So yeah, there's essentially a 4-part process to the methodology. And that is simply step 1, assessment, where you're completing an onboarding assessment. And this can be done, just internally. Take a, look, it's like, it's the first step too. When I'm a fan of Nikki Boyd, and she helps people to have beautiful homes and offices. And the first thing is like, if you need to clean out your closet, first assess the situation, right? So it's kind of that sort of thing, and so we have an onboarding assessment that just walks you through the different areas. And it says, okay, here's some of activities in these areas. Are you doing any of these things? And if so, which ones? And are there other things that you're doing that you might suggest or contribute to this? So that's step 1. Step 2 is actual implementation, where you look at the framework, which we'll talk about in a bit, and you plan, you schedule to implement activities that fall within the framework. So if you were inspired by going through the assessment to say, oh, I think we can try this, or this sounds good, or we're thinking of doing this, or we've seen other people do this, then you can actually plan for it, incorporate it into your calendar, right? Of just like any other activity. And then the third thing is to track. So you schedule a quarterly internal review. So at least once a quarter, you're talking about the efforts in each category and just how things are going, and making sure that it's not just like, oh, we wanted to do this, we signed the pledge, we had the best of intentions, and it just fell by the wayside and you kind of reverted back. So by making sure that you're scheduling that quarterly review and holding yourself accountable, the team is coming back and reporting how things are going with the various activities. And then finally measuring, and that's where you reassess annually to measure progress and to benchmark against where you were and how far along you've come. So that's the methodology.
So just to kind of reiterate back kind of some of the thoughts and what I heard was, so it starts with kind of the assessment, laying the foundation of where we are. And I've taken the assessment myself. So I've seen, as you go through it, it's like, oh, wow, there's all these gaps. But part of that is then, as you move into that kind of implementation, those are also cues to say, these are activities that I can use to start actually doing that work in a more effective fashion. And so that first part is, laying the foundation of, where that gap falls and how we can start to better that. And then we move into implementation, which is, planning on some of those activities that you might have been inspired by from the assessment, or just other things that you've seen in the community or around the ecosystem. And then we start looking at tracking, which is really the data behind the work. Are we actually moving the needle and building our diverse team? And then, you mentioned the kind of scheduling those quarterly check-in points, right? And I think that if you juxtapose that with your culture as well, right? So it's like, hey, when we're looking at the data, are we also rewarding some of the behaviors that are driving more inclusive spaces and environments for our team to be built? And then lastly is that kind of measuring aspect, which is the benchmark for where we want to go in the future. So, and I'm guessing that's kind of a circular process that we can continue to do. Is there any other elements you want to share on kind of that four-step methodology?
I will say this, and like, this is all part of, it's a free startup DEI, framework and assessment that we offer when you become a startup DEI signatory. And it's not something that's name, blame, shame. It's about like, here's some tools, let's work on this together. Teamwork makes the dream work. That's really what it's designed to be. So people can go into this with confidence that, even all of that, you're not, we provide kind of a feedback at kind of where you are based on what activities you are doing. But you're assessed based on what elements within the framework you're doing and not the activities. The activities are really designed to be inspiration, as you mentioned, and for you to also contribute things that you're doing. And so the whole ethos of this is really supportive and not punitive. And I think that's really important because it's easy to feel self-conscious where you might like, oh, I'm feeling short, I'm falling short here, or, I thought we were doing better. And the one word of caution is that sometimes you get into something like this, right? And you're like, yeah, I have the best intentions, but if you're not following through on the execution, which is going to happen if you're not, following through on the tracking and the measurement, what tends to happen, and I've seen it happen before, is there'll be a blow up. You might say, okay, I'm committed. You bring someone in, or you bring folks into the culture, and then they're encountering issues of microaggressions, and the team is not equipped to deal with it. And so now it becomes like a mini crisis where people are feeling guilty. They're kind of panicking. They might feel like a loss of control. There's a lot of different dynamics that come up, and that's part of doing the work, and you can work through it. But if you're going through this framework, and you're applying the methodology, you can really anticipate and avoid some of the worst of it. And you can really build a lot of confidence and comfort and a sense of belonging as you're building that inclusive team, regardless of the background, whether it's, the usual suspects or not. You build that trust and sense of belonging where even if there are, incidents, there's a trust and safety where it can be dealt with in a less stressful way.
Okay. One of the thoughts on this assessment, is this something that you would see, just a founder or co-founder doing, or like to what degree would a team, is this, say you bring on an advisor and they've been working on, in the company for a while, is that something that maybe they do an assessment from their perspective and you have different inputs to see where you're at on a more collective basis? Or is this something that just the founder does and sees where, their gap might be?
That's a great question. I think at the first and foremost, you want your founder or founders to do the assessment. And I think it's great if you have a couple of founders, maybe a tech founder, business founder, design founder, to all do it. And it's very short. It can be done in 10, 15 minutes, and compare notes. And that could be one of the agenda items when you're, getting into the execution in implementation, right? You can compare notes and see how things are going. You can certainly have other people contribute who might have different insights, right? So yeah, absolutely. And everyone who participates gets a certificate of participation. And that is the part where you could say, hey, I got it, I got my badge, I'm doing the work, I've started the journey, right? But then it gives you those tools to have that discussion and begin the implementation. So yeah, I think it's good. And then, there are other tools, and we've partnered with M-Train, and we could talk about that a bit more in the conversation. M-Train is a culture analytics platform, and they help companies with everything from, compliance and harassment to, DEI. And, again, there's tools within that include some benchmarking. So you actually can have different people in your organization, different departments, complete like little mini assessments and trainings that are a lot of fun and very well done, and a lot more user-friendly than, some of the just bringing in a consultant and being put into a circle and not being prepared at all, right, for, what's about to unfold. So yeah, I think it's something that, really everybody has to be on board in. And I think you're going to get the most out of it when, whether it's, the initial assessment or some of the, supplemental tools, the more buy-in that you get from everyone, the more confident that people are going to feel about it. And they're going to understand that the true intent is that diversity really does include you. And they're going to benefit from, all of the learnings as well.
Great stuff. And it makes me think of kind of the programs that we run. How would you see some like ecosystem support organizations, say like the Carlson Center, or I know you're involved with like Berkeley Skydeck and, Village Capital, and at what like stage of kind of the startup process would one take this assessment? And is that something that, as we're kind of looking at curriculum that we support founders with, is that something that goes along with like a cultural module, or is it, like as a tool that they can use as they're building their company culture? Where do you kind of see that in the process of the startup life?
I am so glad you asked that, because really, all of these organizations that you mentioned would do very well to provide this tool to founders in their ecosystem. I've done some presentations with 500 startups, with Berkeley Skydeck, et cetera. And, they definitely see the value. There's actually another opportunity pledge that's specific for limited partners who invest in venture capital, for venture capitalists, angel groups, and accelerators. They can participate in that for their own organizations. And I really built this tool because a lot of them are coming out and saying, okay, well, what about our portfolio companies? And I had some, and then I just had a catalytic moment that, kind of propelled me to go ahead and put this out as well. But so there's something from that top down level. And then, I think what would be even better than just having me come in and speak, which I'm happy to do, but to actually like hold workshops where, founders can go through, spend that 10 minutes of going through the assessment and workshop with other founders, and share what they think and build community around that, and just talk about, get very comfortable talking about it. Because I have this saying, when I launched the Founder Institute here in Sacramento, we'd have founders, sometimes they stand up in the front of the room and we just leave them standing there for a minute while we got, everything set up. And so you're getting comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Because, you're about to pitch, you got the EBGB weebies and the butterflies and everything. But it's the same thing, like with diversity, oftentimes you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable until it's comfortable. And then it's so much fun. It's like you got cool points, and we have the saying in the Black community that you get a black card. Sometimes you get a black card, you get a pass for the day, you're part of the community, you get the secret handshake and stuff. You know what I mean? It becomes fun because now you're inside in the community. It's like if you've lived abroad, or you're into like, a certain kind of, culture, you've just taken an affinity to it and you've been exposed to it. It has a special place in your heart. And so when you do this kind of work, you start having that, again, that empathy, you start having that sense of, oh, we may be different, but, I can relate, I can understand a little bit more. And you take pride in having that understanding, like being able to greet somebody in another language. It's like you're able to do that, but in an authentic way that doesn't come across as offensive or appropriative, because you've done the work to understand those dynamics, right? So I think it's great to workshop these tools within startup organizations and any ecosystem. Absolutely.
Love it. Well, I definitely will look at applying that. I just kind of came to that, as we were chatting, was like, oh, that'd be a great way for us to, I know I've taken it, but was one where it's like, oh, this would be a great tool to teach. And I like the way that you positioned it, and workshopping it is seeing where those gaps are and sourcing ideas for how you can, close those gaps for sure. So
that's why I like to hang out with you, Cameron. You're brilliant.
I don't know about that.
You're modest, but
So the next part was, I know we talked a little bit about the methodology behind it. Want to dive a little bit deeper into the framework that you've set up to help encourage companies to really remain engaged in providing practical guidelines and, some of that external accountability, the positive encouragement and that support for them to continue this work. Can you share with us the 4 parts of the framework that you've built out?
Absolutely. So moving from the methodology to the implementation involves the framework, right? And so there's 4 parts to that. One is assimilation. Then we go into engagement, execution, and entrenchment. So each of those has one or more subcategories. So we'll just start with assimilation. Traditionally, you hear the word assimilation, you think, oh, you're supposed to fit into the dominant culture. But at the root of that word, it's really a process of taking in and fully understanding the approach that we are providing to optimizing your unique culture. So it's not about blending in or conforming, but by innovating and recalibrating for excellence. And like as at Diversity Ventures, we like to say, capitalizing on diverse perspectives. So it's really about that. There's really one subcategory here, and that's just awareness raising. So if you go in and you take the assessment, you're going to get a whole bunch of activities that are suggestions on how you can help raise awareness. You mentioned something like the Harvard implicit bias test, right? And those are, around gender, around ethnicity, light skin, dark skin, nationality. There's just a plethora of resources. I just retook some actually. And, it's surprising. Like I have biases because I'm a product of the environment I'm in. I think one of the differences is that I anticipate and expect to have those biases, and I'm doing the work always to recognize, that they're there. And so then I can compensate for them by being very intentional about it. And we can debug a little bit. And sometimes there'll be, remnants, like if you debug a computer of a virus, you might have some little remnant in there, but, that doesn't mean that you don't do the work to start, breaking it down. So that's assimilation. Engagement, part 2, is really about building upon the company's efforts to collect and assimilate information and to support performance goals, right? Just like you would do in any other, area of a successful company. And so the engagement category has 2 subcategories. Those are in your policy and in your governance, right? So the policies are, what you set forth and put in writing and, you plan out. And then the governance is, how you carry those out, right? The third part is the execution. So you have your policies and governance aligned. The next step is execution. And this involves your recruitment, both internally and externally. How are you promoting people? How are you reaching out to people? What do your job descriptions look like? What pools are you going to? Are you only going to HBCUs when 90% of people of color, who go to college aren't in HBCUs? Like, yes, you want to go to HBCUs, but you also might want to tap into some affinity groups outside of HBCUs, right? Like, so if you're already recruiting from Stanford and Harvard and Berkeley and MIT and Sac State and, wherever else, are you tapping into the affinity groups? I know that I've tapped into some affinity groups at Sac State, and they're there, whether it's gender, ethnicity, or, other affinity groups. So looking at things like that, how are we internally and externally recruiting, creating, allocating, and disseminating resources, whether it is, the bias test, or maybe some creative content, or, maybe it's also about creating affinity groups within your culture, or building capacity and monitoring your progress. So some subcategories in execution, again, include recruitment, resources, monitoring, building capacity. And then we get into entrenchment. So as you're executing on the actions that you've committed to, that you have identified, that might have inspired you, that you've already maybe even started, there may be some diversity fatigue, as I call it, which is basically, a cognitive dissonance, right? So say, for example, if you've always believed like, hey, I can't find a woman to bring onto my advisory board or onto my team, I've tried everything and I just can't find them, you have this mindset. So part of it is, if that's the mindset you have, you're already at a disadvantage, right, at finding them, because you're constantly telling yourself that you can't, that there's a pipeline issue. And so, you can get fatigued with that. And you can also get fatigued when you're bringing people in and there might be issues that you have to work through and it's uncomfortable. That can be fatiguing if you've not exercised that muscle, right? Like, so many of us who have to, live with these issues, we get fatigued, right? But we're a little bit stronger because we've had to deal with it for so long. If it's new for you, then that fatigue may come on sooner. And so you have to kind of anticipate that, right? And, you might bring someone in and like I said, some people you might bring in and they may not have had similar advantages, right? So they might need a little bit of, training, upskilling, and then they might just take off, right? And not everybody works out, right? So we're not saying that everybody's going to work out, but then you might have some people that come in that are so excellent that causes cognitive dissonance and intimidation. And you have to process feeling some kind of way about that. That can also cause diversity fatigue. So there's a lot of different ways that can manifest. So you have to be prepared for that as biases and dissonance are explored, examined, and dismantled. And then, you have to understand that this can lead to a process of progress retrenchment. And that's something where if you have a status quo that there's been some progress made on dismantling, right? It's a process whereby it's a take back, right? It's almost like a clawback of like a white supremacist ideology or a white privilege kind of environment. And, I know that all of those can be trigger words that we don't like to say in polite company, but they exist, right? And so actually the Aspen Institute has a racial equity theory of change that talks about, anticipating and preparing for that. And they give an example of like the gains made in the civil rights movement, and an example of retrenchment might be like COINTELPRO and the war on drugs and, incarceration, right? Like mass incarceration. Those were ways where the gains of the civil rights movement were essentially retrenched back. And so anyway, that's just a part of the entrenchment of anticipating that. And so you can proactively plan to mitigate this by falling back and focusing on the entrenching processes that ensure that the outcomes are established. And so this part of the framework includes two subcategories that will help to achieve entrenchment, and that is compensation and evaluation and mentoring. Now, the mentoring is twofold. Traditionally, we think of mentoring as, oh, this person came from this, underprivileged environment, and we're going to mentor them and get them a sponsor and move them up the corporate ladder. All of that is important, but you also need mentors as leaders of people who have done the work, who have maybe experienced some of these challenges, and for you as a leader and people within your company to be mentored on doing the work. And I'll just kind of like underscore this in saying that a lot of times, especially when you look at the big tech companies and they're talking about pipeline and they're talking about recruitment and they're talking about retention, the focus is really like, oh, we need more people of color in these degrees, or and then we do the data, we research the data, it's like, actually, they're there. You're just not reaching them, right? And so we dismantle this mythology, and then it's like, now what, right? And so part of the reason why people fall back into those mythologies is because they may not have, the mentorship to understand what they are. And, really the problem most of the time can be identified if you go to any TechCrunch article and look for diversity topics and you read in the comments. That's where most of the problem lies in, recruitment and retention, because of the toxicity that's within these cultures. And like we mentioned before, once you get beyond 15, now you're fixing it. So you need to support the people that are already in the organization to do the work, right? So that they have mentors as well on adapting to diversity and equity and inclusion as part of a corporate culture, and that they're not feeling that it's something that that puts them at opposition, that they don't become a villain, that they don't become a victim, and that they don't become discouraged or afraid because things are changing. So they need to be supported so that they can also reap the rewards and feel included.
Okay, so I'm going to go kind of back through just to reiterate some of the things I heard, and good thing I have some notes because there's a lot of good content there. But the first part of the framework is assimilation. And I remember first taking the test, and I reached out to you. I was like, I thought this was not what we were supposed to be doing. And so we had a good conversation, and that kind of awareness raising around bias. And one of the things that came to mind just as you were sharing some of those examples, there's a good book called The Blind Spot, and really it has some good tests in there to and you can do the test within the book, and it kind of shares some of your biases and things like that. And it's sometimes as simple as even I think they were looking at like biases around like the way you looked at a flower or certain things like that. So it was like a really interesting kind of a book to look at that. And then the next was the next part of the framework was engagement, and really looking at how we're supporting the performance goals. And part of that is how are we building that into the policy and the governance of who the organization is, right? And those are the two subcategories there. And then execution, I think that one of the key components was recruitment. And I wanted to share just a brief example was as we were looking at our second round of our cohort for fourth wave, that was something where, it's a targeted program towards female founders, but there was still not as diverse in terms of founders of color. And so being intentional of how we connected to those networks, right? It wasn't just using the same particular channels, but really building relationships with other organizations. And that really helped our recruitment in terms of getting female founders of color. So, doing that extra work to build those relationships and connecting new dots that you didn't have before. And then the last component was that entrenchment and kind of that difference between, looking at, doing the work here, but sometimes it's like then that steps backwards are happening on another side. So really building that into who you are as a company, and that could be through compensation and mentoring. And I think, one of the things when we think of mentoring is taking a step past that to be more of that sponsor where you're actually opening doors and taking those steps forward, right? It's not just about, hey, I'm giving you advice, but actually opening doors and making things happen. So thank you for sharing that framework. And I can't believe we're only 10 minutes away from the end of the conversation here. So I think we talked a lot about the tools. I know there's one probably additional tool that we want to share. So if you want to share any last tools that founders can use to set themselves up for success in building a diverse team and for kind of some of those outsized returns.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the recap and for the additional resources. I love that. I love that anchoring. So yeah, like as I mentioned, if you go to the Tech Funding Equity site and you engage in the Tech Funding Equity Startup DEI pledge, we do have a certificate of participation for going through the assessment, and that will actually unlock a suite of tools that have been generously provided to us by M-Train, which is the cultural analytics platform that I mentioned before. And by the way, I should give a plug. So Janine Yancey, the CEO, well, I think she brought on another CEO. She's just moving and shaking and growing so much. But the founder, Janine Yancey, actually went through Fourth Wave Female Founder Accelerator. And she graduated from my alma mater, UC Berkeley, and was an employment attorney for big tech firms. And based on some of the experiences and insights there, she built this wonderful tool that's so easy and engaging. You get to watch short, very well made, explanatory videos and answer very simple questions and really see how your company benchmarks in each area. So I just bullet pointed a few of the resources that they provide when you go in and you complete the assessment. So those are just some tools. And as I mentioned, in every subcategory, there are suggested activities that you can do within that to do the work. And I just want to reiterate that yes, it can be uncomfortable at first. I know more than anyone. And so, if you're doing the work and you're feeling this discomfort, I would just say, welcome to the club. Hopefully you have some empathy on how other people may feel, because it's uncomfortable for, folks who have been on, the short end of the stick. But, it goes such a long way when you do that work and you're bringing it to the table and you're just saying, hey, I'm afraid of messing up. I'm afraid of putting my foot in my mouth. I'm a little nervous about this. That also builds trust and empathy, and it allows people to really extend a lot of grace because they know that it's not intentional, right? That you're trying to unpack it, and we're all unpacking. Even, those of us who, like, as a Black woman, sometimes I'm like, I need to unpack stuff, right? Because when you're, subject to it, sometimes you bring that bias too, and thinking that someone is doing something out of malice, and you have to do that work too. So when you're doing it as a culture, you just build this level of trust and camaraderie that is so rewarding, and it helps just to make more cohesion that you might even not have an opportunity to build in just your normal course of work, depending on what your company is all about. This really brings, I almost want to say, even a level of intimacy in terms of how you bond, because you're doing something uncomfortable. It's like going out into the woods and camping together, you grow up and you're on a sports team or something. You have this level of intimacy. You're breaking bread, you're going on road trips. It's that level of depth and connection that you're creating within the company. And so I would just say, even though it may be uncomfortable at first, lean in, push through it. I'm, known for giving the mom analogies. You have a kid, you got to carry it, then you got to go through that labor process, right? And it is painful, but on the other side of it, it's so rewarding to do the work. So however you look at it, whatever analogy that you want to use, I just want to encourage folks who might feel a little comfortable about it. It is worth it. And at the other side of it, it is so much fun, and you get your player's cards. So
work towards the player's card. Well,
that's right.
I appreciate that. Certainly the last point there. And I know we've, had many conversations, but that's certainly, stepping into the uncomfortableness. And, as a white male, I can say this was, certainly, a familiar face and one that we've had many conversations. So it's a little bit easier, but definitely is not an easy one to have. In terms of feeling comfortable. And I always learn in our conversations and appreciate those perspectives. So just appreciate you taking the time to have the conversation with us here and educating us on the methodology and framework that you've built through tech funding equity. So
it's my pleasure.
Yeah, and I think so we have time we have 5 minutes left, so it's flown by. So I've loved the conversation. I know Laura threw a question in the chat. I don't know if you want to read it out loud, Laura, or if you want me to. I prefer to have your voice in here.
Yeah, so a lot of times I'll see like a founder's team for an early stage startup, and it's all white guys. And I mean, how do you nicely advise them that to look at having a more diverse team?
Great question, Laura. And just FYI, I put, my LinkedIn address and my email in the chat for those who, want to reach out. So Laura, to your point, it happens all the time. And, sometimes folks come to me and they're like, this is what I got and I don't know what to do with it. And I would just say, number one, I think it's helpful not to be overly judgmental or punitive, because going back to the start of the conversation, a lot of times it's just about the network. These are their friends. This is who they know, and the folks that, trusted them enough to take the risk of building a company together. And so just understanding that we are in a country that has de facto segregation. You start there, and if you come from a place of not being judgmental, people will be more receptive. Like, you understand how they got there, right? And then you can just make suggestions like, hey, are you aware that, NASDAQ is requiring this, or, California is requiring this and this? How are you thinking of moving towards those goals, and kind of get a sense of where they're at and thinking about it. And if they're even aware of what the environment is, or what the needs are, what the benefits are, the business case, and how they can strengthen and protect and preserve their company and grow their company more effectively and have better returns for their stakeholders if they do move in that direction. And so, just asking those Socratic questions, I think sometimes is helpful, and then just providing them with the resources. And this can be one of them, right? And, there's certainly increasing number of other kind of resources that you can, contribute. You as a woman, you can be helpful in being a connector. I mean, you've been a connector to me. You probably know more Black founders in the Sacramento region than I do, right? And so just like guiding them and maybe recommending some folks that they could bring onto their advisory board that have broader networks. So just things like that, like, oh, here's some suggestions. You might want to think about talking to A, B, or C, and I'd be happy to, request an intro and just see how they respond to that. And if they're a little bit, hostile, they might be kind of early on doing the work, then, just nudging them towards some resources where they can, create a little more self-awareness is probably a good start. But you got to plant the seed, water the seed. And, if that's the state of the culture right now, it might not change overnight. And that's okay, because like I say, when you have a baby, going back to the mom analogies, that baby, most chance that baby is going to walk, right? Barring some disability or something like that, that baby's going to be able to walk, but they're not going to walk overnight. It's going to be a process. So just supporting in that and encouraging in that, I feel is the way to, really help them take pleasure and joy and look forward to that process. And you might have a track star on your hands, but they're not going to get there overnight. You can accelerate that process, certainly. But, I just feel like being encouraging and, asking discovery questions is a great way to start.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. You're amazing. You're such a gem.
All right. Any last questions? We're about at time here.
You got like 30 seconds.
30 seconds. All right. Well, I will then draw us to a close and just want to say thank you, Mariah, for the time and the conversation. I always appreciate our conversations and appreciate all the work that you do and just your friendship overall as well. It's great conversation and so many great tools shared. And I look forward to utilizing the startup assessment, our DEI assessment going forward. I think that was a good takeaway, certainly for me, to start to apply and look forward to our future work together and tapping into more diverse teams to unlock outsized returns. So thank you,
Likewise,
Mariah.
Cameron. And I just appreciate you so much and your wonderful leadership, not only of the Carlson Center, but of this event, which I know is a Herculean event. I just think our region is so fortunate to have you, and we've seen you in different roles, but I'm particularly excited about you being at the Carlson Center. And of course, the Carlson Center was endowed by one of our great leaders in this region. And I feel like we have so much potential to influence the rest of the nation by the work that we do here. And so I'm glad to be doing part of that work with you. You're amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the time and the energy, and we'll let you all go and celebrate the rest of Global Entrepreneurship Week. And thank you, Mariah, and we'll see you all later.
One thing, happy Veterans Day.
Happy Veterans Day indeed. Yes, we jumped right into it. Happy Veterans Day. Celebrate the service of our military leaders. And yes, thank you all for being here. Bye-bye.